الحمد لله الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله تبارك وتعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Now, continuing from the second lesson we had last week with regards to the intimacy of marriage, if you have the handouts in front of you, we reached page number 2, and the last point I mentioned was regarding preparation for intimacy and sexual relations. In other words, it's very, very important for both the husband and wife that they prepare themselves, not just mentally being ready for it, but also at the same time externally as well. And I mentioned in terms of it's very, very important for husbands and wives to, beautify themselves, adorn themselves, wear nice clothing, to wear even revealing or intimate clothing, even various types of lingeries for wives and so on, because it is done with the intention to please the husband, or because it is being done with the intention for the sole pleasure of the husband. So these kind of things will be considered to be permissible and lawful. Now, moving along to the next part of today's lesson regarding foreplay. Now, I've mentioned there, if we have a look at the notes, that the husband should not rush into intercourse before he feels that his wife is ready for it. He should be especially kind and gentle with her. So what I mean by that is, it's what we call in Arabic as mula'aba, which means that before a husband has relations with his wife, it is imperative, it is paramount that the husband prepares his wife, and similarly the wife prepares her husband for the actual relation and for the actual intimacy, for the actual intercourse itself. It shouldn't be that husband and wives, or in particular the husband, he shouldn't basically jump onto his wife and have relations with her without preparing her, without getting her ready. But instead, it is very important that the husband is gentle with his wife. He's kind of prepares her, he kind of gets her ready, so that the intercourse and the relations will be very, very beneficial and will be very, very good. Now, if we have a look at the next part of the section about foreplay, it goes on to explain about Ibn Qudama rahimullah. Now, Ibn Qudama rahimullah is a very famous Hanbali scholar. So Ibn Qudama rahimullah says that it is recommended for the man to caress and fondle his wife prior to intercourse, in order to arouse her so that she would get as much pleasure from the intercourse as he does. What does that mean? It means here that it is recommended, i.e. mustahab, desirable, for the husband to kind of caress and fondle his wife. I basically get her ready, touching her, stroking her parts and so on and so forth, so that she is ready for the actual intercourse and for the actual relations. If we then move on to the next part of the paragraph, there's actually a hadith which can be found in Imam Ghazali rahimullah's Ihya'ul Ulum, and also in Imam Daylami's Musnadul Firdaus. And in the hadith is narrated by Anas bin Malik radhiyallahu anhu where it says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, none of you should come to his wife like an animal. So none of you should approach his wife like an animal, but rather there should be between him and her a messenger. So there should be a kind of a messenger and a Rasul between the two. Now what do you mean by messenger here? So he then goes on to explain, it was said, what is the messenger, O Prophet of Allah? So he, i.e. the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, replied by saying, kissing and words. In other words, speaking to her in a nice way, even in an erotic way. There's nothing wrong with that because she happens to be a wife. It's not like you're speaking to a strange woman in an erotic way. That would be haram and unlawful. But she's a wife, you can speak to her in an erotic way, in an intimate way. There's nothing shameful, there's nothing unlawful about it. And also, number two, the second thing which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned was with regards to kissing. And if you then look at the next part of the handouts, I mentioned that foreplay, there's many types of foreplay, but two which is very, very important, which gets the wife ready for the actual relations, for the actual intimacy, and that is the kissing. That is number one. And number two is the massaging and the caressing of the body. Now I'll just pause for a second before I continue with the next part of the dars and the lesson. Any questions any brothers or sisters they would like to ask me through the messaging system at the bottom of the screen on the right hand corner. Any questions? Nope. Okay, I'll continue. Now let's have a look at these two words which I mentioned, which is parts of foreplay and mula'aba. One is kissing and the other one is massaging or caressing the body. So what do we mean by that, or just some additional rules with regards to that? Now let's have a look at kissing firstly. Now kissing here means passionate kissing is allowed with one's wife. So what I mean by passionate kissing, it could be on her cheeks, on her lips, even to the extent that sucking the tongue of one's wife, that's what's called in the books of fiqh as qublai fahisha, i.e. sucking the tongue of one's wife. That is also permissible and that is also allowed as well. And there is a hadith which can be found in Sunan Abu Dawood. So a hadith of Sunan Abu Dawood, narrated by Sayyidah Aisha radhiyallahu anha, where it's got the words Anna Nabiyya sallallahu alayhi wasallam kana yuqabbiluha wa huwa sa'imun. That Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam would kiss her, yuqabbiluha wa huwa sa'imun, whilst he would be in the state of fasting. And then the hadith mubarakah then goes on to explain wa yamussu lisanaha, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would even suck her tongue. Wa yamussu lisanaha, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would even suck her tongue. Now I don't want to go into too detail about this particular hadith, whether such kissing breaks the fast or not. That is got to do more with Sawm and fasting, and probably be a good idea that probably before the month of Ramadan we may even have a fiqh of fasting course, say for example. But what this hadith is telling us, just looking at the hadith from on its face value, وَيَمُسُّ لِسَانَهَا, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would even suck the tongue of Hazrat Aisha radhiyallahu anha. So from this we can understand and derive the permissibility of passionate kissing, sucking one's wife's tongue is permissible and that is allowed. So that is one type of, like, one form of kissing. Now remember, kissing is not just permissible or is not just allowed on the cheeks or on the lips, but actually it is permissible for a husband to kiss the entire body of his wife. So what I mean by that is that it's permissible for him to kiss his wife, say for example, forearms, to kiss his wife's stomach, to kiss her legs, to kiss her thighs, even to the extent that to kiss her breast and so on. All these things will be permissible. What I mean is that the entire body of the wife, a husband is allowed to kind of explore, is allowed to kiss, is allowed to touch. All these things are permissible for the husband to do. Now this then takes me on to the next ruling here about kissing, and as I just explained to the brothers and sisters online, that it is permissible to kiss, or for a husband to kiss his wife's breast, say for example. Now this leads to a question here as to, just say for argument's sake, if a husband whilst kissing his wife's breast by mistake or accidentally sucked some milk from his wife. So just accidentally he sucked some milk from his wife. So what would be the masla and the ruling in regards to that? In other words, would his marriage with his wife be cancelled or annulled or rescinded? Is he a sin? What is the legal ramifications regarding such an action? Now in a nutshell, according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimullah, he is of the opinion that such an action does not break the nikah, does not break the marriage. Now I'm sure you must have done some kind of fiqh of marriage courses on Cordoba Academy or with other institutions, and they may have mentioned something about rada'at, fosterage. Now according to the majority of the scholars, fosterage between a child and a suckling mother is only established if the fosterage or if the suckling took place within 2 years, according to other imams like Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, Imam Ahmed, and according to 2.5 years according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimullah. So if the suckling, so if a man or someone was to drink the milk of a woman, but beyond or after 2.5 years, then there is no kind of ruling of fosterage established between the two. So therefore, according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimullah, he is of the opinion, also the other imams as well, that if a man did accidentally drank the milk of his wife, then the nikah would not break, but for him to do that intentionally would be considered to be unlawful and sinful. If it was done accidentally, then fair enough, he should just repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his shortcomings. But if it was done, say for example, intentionally or even accidentally, the nikah and the marriage will not break. So the nikah and the marriage will not break, but the actual thing itself would not break the marriage. But for him to do that intentionally would be considered unlawful and would be considered haram. Now this then takes me on to another point with regards to say for example kissing one's wife, and I mentioned before that it is permissible to kiss one's wife over her entire body. And this then leads to a question as to whether it is permissible to kiss one's wife's private parts. So is that permissible or not? Now the rule, we'll come back to this later, this particular rule with regards to oral sex and these kind of things. We'll mention that later. But we're just talking about here the outer part of the private parts, whether it is permissible for the husband to do something like that or not. So the masla or the ruling is that if that area is dry, so if it's like a dry area, then it is permissible for the husband to kind of kiss it. Remember, we're not talking about oral sex here where it includes the sucking of the private parts and so on. I'll mention that later on in the course. But what we're talking about here is more like the actual, just the kissing of the dry part of the private parts. So whether that is allowed or not. So if it's just dry and the husband just kisses that, or if the male's private part is dry and a woman kisses just the dry part of the male's private part, then there's nothing wrong with it, i.e. that would be allowed. However, obviously if it's wet and there's impurities, madhi, even money kind of around that particular area, then for a husband to kind of kiss that area, or vice versa, for the husband to kind of swallow the impurity and the najas, the madhi and the money, then that would be unlawful and that would be haram. So that would not be permissible. But if it's just a dry area and a husband was to just kiss that, then that in itself would be considered to be permissible and lawful. I'll just leave it there for a couple of seconds. Any questions any brothers have or any sisters they would like to ask? Any questions? You could use the messaging system on the bottom of the screen to ask me any questions. As I said already at the beginning of the talk, that any kind of detailed questions or any questions which I don't have time to answer, then you could always use the Darul Ifta Birmingham website, which is on the whiteboard in front of you. Okay, sister is asking that my voice is kind of breaking. In other words, she can't hear me properly. However, another sister replied by saying that I can hear fine. So I'll try to come a bit closer probably. I think that would be the best way around it. Okay, sister is asking that what about wife kissing the husband's private part? So as already explained, that if the male's private part, the husband's private part, if he's just dry, there's nothing on and there's dry, and she just kisses the, you could say the outer part of it, not the part where the semen or the madhi is coming out from, but she just kind of kisses the other outer part of it, or the on the side, say for example, then that would be allowed. That in itself will be allowed. But remember, as I said, this is just like, say, a kiss or just a peck on it. If it's something like oral sex and so on, there's different rules which we'll inshallah come back to later. Okay, I'll continue with the course now. Obviously, as I was mentioning that foreplay, we're on the topic of foreplay, and I mentioned that there are two things regarding foreplay which we're going to talk about, and some other miscellaneous acts of foreplay which I'll touch on later. So we looked at kissing firstly. Now we're going to move on to the next part regarding massaging and caressing the wife's body, or vice versa, the wife kinds of caressing and massaging the husband's body. So what is the rules with regards to that? Now let's begin with the massaging part. So he goes on to explain that it is permissible for the it is permissible for the husband to touch his wife's body, and also vice versa for a woman to touch the man's body. And there is nothing wrong in the husband stroking, touching, fondling his wife's entire body. So whether it's her breasts, whether it's around her shoulders, whether it's around her arms, her legs, all these kind of things is totally permissible for the husband to do. Similarly, it's permissible for the wife to touch her husband's chest, stomach, shoulders, face. All these kind of things are totally permissible and totally allowed. It is also nothing wrong, or there is nothing wrong, for the husband to touch his wife's private parts, and also for the wife to touch her husband's private parts. So there's nothing wrong in the husband touching his wife's private parts, and similarly for the wife to touch or stroke even the husband's private parts. There's nothing wrong with that. So all these things are permissible and allowed. It is mentioned in Fatawa Hindiya, a very famous Hanafi jurisprudence book. And in Fatawa Hindiya, it's mentioned that once Imam Abu Yusuf rahimullah, so Imam Abu Yusuf, as all of you know, brothers and sisters, that he was the student of Imam Abu Hanifa. So Imam Abu Yusuf rahimullah, he asked Imam Abu Hanifa about, is there anything wrong in a man touching his wife's private parts and the wife touching the man's private parts? Is there anything wrong with that? So Imam Abu Hanifa rahimullah replied by saying no. So there's nothing wrong with it. So what we can understand here is that it's permissible, because remember, you're not like, it's unlike say kissing or oral sex where there's a danger that some impurity may come into your mouth. No impurity is going to be coming into your mouth. So therefore, if you were to touch that area, if you were to, or if the wife was to touch the husband's private parts or vice versa, so there's nothing wrong with it, and this is all part of the husband enjoying the experience with his wife, and the wife experiencing or enjoying her experience with the husband. So technically there is nothing wrong and there is nothing impermissible or unlawful regarding it. Now this then takes me on to another question here, is about whether it's permissible for the husband to insert his fingers into the wife's private parts, and similarly whether it's permissible for the wife to masturbate her husband. Okay, again, forgive me, obviously I may be a bit more may have been a bit more blunt or clear here, but obviously these are like sometimes questions people ask, and obviously, you know, the whole idea of this particular course is to explain these kind of rulings to husbands and wives and to couples. And another point which I should have mentioned right at the beginning of today's lesson is that these things which I'm mentioning about the touching of the body, the touching of the private parts and so on, it's all down to it's all down to, I should say, whether the husband and wife are happy with it. What I mean by that is that, for argument's sake, we're going to look at the ruling regarding whether it's permissible for the husband to insert his fingers into his wife's private parts. Now, just say for argument's sake, if the wife doesn't want that to happen, so fair enough, then it's not, what I'm trying to say is that it's not compulsory for the husband to do that. because when it comes to relations with one's wife or wife with the husband, it's all based on what unity, it's on based on what mutually they kind of agree with each other. So if there is a certain act the husband doesn't want to do, or if there is a certain act the wife doesn't want to do, then there is nothing impermissible or unlawful about them not doing it. Now, going back to the question about whether it is permissible for the husband to insert his fingers into his wife's private parts, or whether the wife can masturbate the husband or not. So the ruling or the masla is that yes, it is permissible, because as I already explained before, that the entire body of your wife, you can derive benefit from her. So if a husband wants to touch the private parts of his wife, even to the extent that he wants to insert his fingers into her private parts so that she gets orgasm and so on, then that is that is fine, that is permissible. And it is also permissible for the wife to make the husband masturbate. That is also allowed and permissible as well. I think I may have mentioned this a couple of weeks back, that for the husband to masturbate himself, that is haram. But obviously if his wife is there and the wife is kind of making him reach orgasm and reach the level of passion which entails in him to release semen, then that is permissible. If the wife is doing that with her hands, making the husband reach orgasm and causing him to masturbate, then that is permissible. So there's nothing haram about that. What will be haram and unlawful is if the husband, say for argument's sake, was doing it himself, then that will be impermissible. But if the wife is causing it, or if the wife is making the husband masturbate, then that is permissible and that is allowed. Just leave it there for a second. Any questions any brothers or sisters would like to ask before we move on to the next part? And just use the messaging system on the right hand corner of your screen, and inshallah I'll try to answer it. As already mentioned, that any questions which I can't answer, or any kind of detailed questions any brothers or sisters would want to ask, then obviously the Darul Ifta Birmingham website address is on the whiteboard in front of your screen, so you could ask the questions there. Okay, sister is asking that, is the wife I think obliged to allow the husband to do whatever he wants? So the answer is not really, not 100% actually, because we're going to look at it later, that there are certain things the husband can't do with his wife, like anal sex or oral sex, these kind of things. The husband can't force that upon the wife. And similarly, there may be certain acts which may be permissible, as I've been mentioning, but the wife doesn't want to do it. So she can, in a way, say to the husband that, look, I don't want that. I don't want you to do that. I feel uncomfortable in this particular way. So if she was to say that, then that's fine. She has a right in saying, because as I already explained before, that as long as there's nothing haram, or as long I mentioned before that relations or intimacy is one of the rights of the wife as well. So if there's a particular way the wife feels uncomfortable about, then she's got a right to actually say that to her husband. Another question here by a sister, I think, or a brother, that is about oral sex, and he's mentioning that some of the scholars have said that it's allowed. So again, regarding the topic of oral sex, inshallah, there is coming up on the next page on the handout, so I'll mention it there in detail. Again, another sister is asking about anal sex and so on, that it is haram, and she wants to know the reason why it's haram. So again, that's coming up on the next page of the handout. I'll mention it there. Okay, I'll continue with the next part of the course. Okay, so we looked at two things already. One is kissing, and the other part was touching, caressing, fondling one's wife. So the rules regarding them two were mentioned in detail. Now we're going to mention some other types of foreplay, which I want to mention. So let's begin with number one, the first one, which is not mentioned in the handouts in front of you, but some of the types of foreplay, or some of the types of things which comes under foreplay, I should say. Now, number one, common question which brothers and sisters ask is that, is it permissible for spouses to see each other's private parts? So is it permissible for husband and wives to see each other's private parts? Is that allowed or not? Now, technically, yes, it is permissible for the husband to see his wife's private parts, and for the wife to see the husband's private parts. Technically, there is nothing wrong with him. However, out of adab and out of respect, or out of haya, I should say, rather than respect, out of haya and modesty, it is preferable not to. And this is because of a hadith which can be found in Sunan Ibn Majah, narrated by Sayyidah Aisha radhiyallahu anha, where it's got the words "Ma ra'aytu farja Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wasallam," that I have not seen or never seen the farj, i.e. the private parts of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, qattu, i.e. ever. So Sayyidah Aisha radhiyallahu anha never looked at the private parts of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So out of haya and modesty, it is preferable and best that husband does not see the wife's private parts, and vice versa, wife doesn't see the husband's private parts. However, if say the husband wants to see it so that he can how should I say, reach reach his full satisfaction, if that makes sense, then it is permissible. And similarly, if the wife, if she wants to have full satisfaction and she wants to see the private parts of the husband, then that would be allowed and that would be permissible as well. I'll just repeat the hadith again. One of the sisters is asking for the words of the hadith. So this hadith is in Sunan Ibn Majah, narrated by Sayyidah Aisha radhiyallahu anha, and the words of the hadith are "Ma ra'aytu farja Rasulillahi sallallahu alaihi wasallam qattu," which means that I have never seen the farj, i.e. the private parts of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, qattu, i.e. ever. So that is another type of foreplay and mula'aba. Another type of foreplay here, which I'm going to mention, is using what we call sex toys. That is that permissible or not? And what I mean by sex toys here, more referring to vibrators, these kind of things. So is it permissible for the wife, say for example, to use these kind of things? Now, sex toys will be, say for example, akin to masturbation. So therefore, if the wife is, say for example, using a vibrator, and in that particular way she is kind of like inserting it into her private parts and deriving benefit, then that would not be allowed. So these kind of things would not be allowed and would not be permissible for the wife to use. there's probably like so many sex toys and these kind of things which are available in the market. Obviously, the ruling which I gave was more regarding vibrators. There may be other kind of toys which may not give the meaning, or sorry, may not give the, what do you call it, may not be similar to vibrators. You don't need to like insert it into the private parts, and it may have different rulings. I'm just saying for argument's sake. But what I'm trying to say is that in a nutshell, it's best to just avoid these kind of things. It's just best to it's best to avoid those kind of things, because it's fahisha in a way, it's immoral in a way as well. So it's best to just avoid these kind of things. But obviously, if it's something like vibrators which are being inserted into the woman's private parts, then obviously that would not be allowed, because that will be akin to it'll be akin to masturbation. Next part, some other examples here of foreplay is of pornography. Alhamdulillah, this is something which is very, very common nowadays, that husbands, again, I don't want to go into too detail about husbands watching pornography by themselves. That is haram, that is unlawful, and that's like a separate issue. But sometimes what happens is that Muslim couples, husband and wives, to get themselves ready for the relations, to get themselves ready for the intercourse and for the time they're going to spend together, what they do is that Muslim husbands and wives, i.e. couples, they view pornography or pornographic material before they have relations. So the question is that allowed or not? So in a nutshell, again, not going to detail, is this is something which is haram, and this is something which is unlawful and impermissible. So any kind of relations like where you're viewing kind of pornographic material, whether via video or whether online before the actual relation itself, that is something which is unlawful, and that is something which is impermissible and haram, and husband and wives are not allowed to view these kinds of materials before they have relations. Sometimes husband and wives, they try to justify it and they say that, well, we're getting ready for the relations and so on. No, that is unlawful, and that is haram, and that is impermissible to do. Okay, let's leave it there for a second. Any questions any brothers or sisters would like to ask? Just a request to the brothers and sisters that please, whilst I'm actually delivering the lesson, if you just refrain from kind of like typing anything, because sometimes it happens that I'm actually delivering and then a message just comes all of a sudden, and then I just lose concentration, and then it's not actually quite good. So please, if you really need to ask a question, then ask the question, type it in. When I give you the couple of minutes after each pause, ask me the question there. Please don't ask whilst I'm actually delivering the talk, because when all these questions coming in, I sometimes lose concentration, and sometimes not actually I get mixed up in what I'm saying. So please, if you could refrain from asking questions whilst I'm actually delivering the talk. Now, some questions which were asked whilst I was delivering the lesson. Obviously, like a sister, I think, made a comment there about oral sex and so on. So as I already explained before, that this is something which I look at later on in the course. Another another question here is about sex toys. That what point I mentioned. So the point I mentioned about sex toys was that if it's something like vibrators, where it entails the vibrator to be inserted into the woman's private parts, then that is something which is unlawful and haram. So that's what I was explaining about that particular point. Uh, yeah, then a brother is asking about the hadith of Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha, about the private parts and so on. So the brother is asking about, is in this particular hadith za'if? Now, as far as I know, that it's za'if according to certain muhaddisins, but not according to all the muhaddisins. So what I will do is that if the brother who asked the question about the hadith of Sayyidah Aisha anha, ma ra'aytu farja Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam qattu, if you could leave me your details or ask that same question on the website daruliftabirmingham.co.uk. So what I'll do is that I'll give inshallah a detailed answer regarding that. Okay, let's move on to the next part of the course. Okay, so we looked at foreplays and so on. Now the next part of the course is where he talks about, just before the position section, there's a paragraph there. So we're just going to quickly have a read of that particular paragraph. So he explains that it is very important that the spouses are alone whilst engaging in sexual intercourse. So it's very important that husband and wives are alone when they are having relations. Nauzubillah, it's not permissible for Muslims to have relations or to have intimacy in a public place. So public place means like, I think, what they call voyeurism. So to have relationships or intimacy outside in the public and so on, in the garden, nauzubillah, where people can see something which is unlawful, impermissible, fahisha, immoral, you name it, it's totally unlawful and haram. And unfortunately we see these kinds of things, well, not see, but we kind of hear of these kind of stories, and we shouldn't be surprised, because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has mentioned a hadith that this is one of the signs of Day of Judgment, that immorality will become common, that intimacy will take place openly outside. So unfortunately this is one of the signs of Day of Judgment, and we kind of see that with our own eyes nowadays. So we just have to obviously refrain from these kind of things, and never ever think about or contemplate ever to have relations outdoors or in public areas. But even at home as well, when we have relations with one's wife, it's very important that children are kept away. If the children are asleep, then that's fine, but they should be away from the room. They should not be awake, and the mother and the father having relations, then that is unlawful, that is haram. It's also very important that the doors are kind of locked, and the curtains are closed. Even when you are having relationship, one should not make too much noise. You should not make too much noise. You should not make too much sound. So or too much sound meaning like such loud sound that the person next door can hear you, or the person in the next room can hear you. So the act of relationship, the act of intimacy, the act of intercourse should be done in a discreet way, in a way which is not made audible and is not made or is not heard by everyone. So that is something which is very, very important. Now just moving on to the next part of the handouts which we have in front of us, regarding positions. In other words, in what way or in what position can a husband have intimacy with his wife? Like, what are the positions that a husband can have intimacy and relations with his wife? Now I've mentioned in total in front of you 5 positions, and the key thing about this particular section is what is mentioned in the Holy Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Nisa'ukum harthul lakum, which means your women are a tillage for you. Fa'atu harthakum anna shi'tum. And then he goes on to say that approach your tillage, approach your cultivation anna shi'tum, the way you want. Now what does that mean? It means that obviously relations such as anal sex, i.e. from the back, that is unlawful and haram. But any other relations where the husband is having or is inserting his private parts into his wife's front private parts, so whichever way that is done, then that form of position or that position would be lawful and would be permissible. What I mean by that is, as long as the intercourse is taking place in the wife's front private parts, then that is allowed, that is permissible. And if it was done from the back private parts, then that is haram and that is unlawful. But whichever position, whether it's the husband on top, the wife on top, whichever position, but it entails the husband having relations with his wife in the front private part, then that is allowed, that is permissible, and that would not be considered unlawful and haram. So if we just have a quick look at the handouts which is in front of us and the positions which are mentioned. So for example, number 1, it's mentioned here is man on top position, i.e. the wife lies on her back whilst the husband lies flat over her in a manner that he covers her body with his. So like the normal position where the wife is on the bottom and then the man on top, and then having relations in that way, then that is permissible and that is allowed. Number 2, the second position here, which is also permissible, is the rear entry position. And what I mean by that is the husband enters his wife, in other words, has relations with his wife, but she, the wife, has her back to him. So the husband, so it's what we call the rear entry position. So the husband has relations with his wife, but in such a way that the wife's back is to the husband. So that's like a second position. But remember, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say here that re-entry position means anal sex. No, it means that the husband is having penetration or intercourse in the front of the wife's private parts, but he's approaching her, or he's inserting his private parts into his wife's front private parts from the back. So that is called rear entry position. Number 3, a third position which is which we have here is the side by side position. So that basically means where the spouses lie on their sides facing each other, or they lie on their side and the husband enters the private parts from behind. So that is also allowed as well. Number 4, another position here which is mentioned is regarding the standing position. So husband having relations with his wife from a standing position, as long as the male private part is entering the front private part, then that is allowed, whether, as I mentioned there, whether both spouses are facing each other or whether from behind. And the 5th position which is mentioned here is the woman or the wife on top position, where the husband lies on the bed or on his back, and then the wife is on top, and then they have relations in that way. Then that is also permissible and allowed as well. So these are 5 positions which are mentioned. Remember, the key thing is that as long as the dhakar, the male front private part, is entering the wife's front private part, whichever way that is done, whether it entails the wife being on top or husband being on top or on the side, whichever way it is, but as long as that is happening, then that would be considered to be lawful and permissible. Any questions any brothers or sisters would like to ask, can please use the messaging system on the right hand corner. Again, do you know the 5 positions which I mentioned? Again, it's all down to what the husband and wife are comfortable with. I know I mentioned 5 here, but just say for example, if the wife is not comfortable with, say for example, she being on top, then the husband can't force her to do that. So I just mentioned 5 things. It doesn't mean that, oh, now the husband has to do these kind of 5 things, and then, using this as an example, or then otherwise it's going to be haram. No, it's just like these are 5 legitimate or permissible ways of having relations with one's wife. If there is a particular position the wife doesn't like or the husband doesn't like, then the other spouse can't force the husband or can't force the wife to do that. It's, remember, when it comes to relations and just in general relationship about marriage, it's got to do with what the husband and wife are, compatible, what the husband and wife like for themselves. Okay, a question a sister asked is regarding what is the difference between rear entry and side by side position. I think probably rear entry probably means from you approach the wife from the back. I think that's probably will mean that the male private part is going through the back area, so you're not and then it's going into the private part, whereas on the side it's more like the husband and wife are kind of like on the side of each other, and then the husband approaches her in that particular way. Any other questions? Nope. Okay. Let's move on to the next part. Okay, now the next part here is regarding other forms of sexual relations between the husband and the wife. So other forms of sexual activity between the husband and wife, whether that is permissible or not. Now, if we have a look at the handout which is in front of us, I mentioned 2 things here very quickly. One is anal sex, oral sex, number 2, and then later on in the section, phone sex. So these are the 3 topics which we're going to be looking at for the next part of the course. Okay, now let's have a look at. Okay, now okay, I think somebody just picked their hand up there. Okay, alright, I'll just continue, inshallah. Okay, now let's have a look at firstly anal sex. Now, anal sex, firstly, what it means, I'm sure everybody knows what it means, but anal sex basically means where a husband has relations, has intercourse with his wife, but he inserts his private parts into his wife's back private parts. In other words, he inserts his private parts into his wife's anus and doubled what we call in Arabic. So that is called anal sex. Now, anal sex is something which is haram and unlawful, and in front of you you have a reference to a hadith which can be found in Sunan al-Tirmidhi, where narrated by Sayyiduna Ibn Abbas anhu, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not look at a man who comes to a man, or who approaches a man. In other words, in Arabic, what we call liwatat. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not like liwatat. And number 2, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not like and will not look at a person in the hereafter who approaches a woman through her back. So in other words, anal sex or homosexuality is something which is strictly haram and strictly prohibited in Islam, something which is not loved and liked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, sister was asking before in the messages that why is it unlawful and haram? Now, first and foremost, and this is quite important as well, that there are many things which are mentioned in the Quran or Hadith to be unlawful, and there are no reasons behind it. There's no wisdoms behind it. And always keep this in mind that, there are certain things which it's an order of Allah, and there's no wisdoms or there's no reasons behind it. Because if you start questioning every single thing, why is this unlawful, why is this lawful, then what happens is that you're then going to start questioning the entire deen, and you're going to start questioning about Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that why was he made a prophet, why couldn't I be made a prophet. And if you start asking why for everything, then you're just going to get deviated and you're going to go away from the straight path. So first and foremost, don't ask why and why for everything. There's certain rules, but it's an order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's it. That's what we need to know. Obviously, just to make people understand that why is it unlawful and haram. So why is it unlawful and haram? So first few reasons. Number one is we are not allowed to waste our semen. The semen, we are not allowed to waste it. And the idea is that every time you have relations with one's wife, then it should be done with the intention of anna shi'tum, that fa'atu harthakum anna shi'tum wa qaddimu li anfusikum, that it should be done with the intention of increasing the population. It should be done with the intention of procreation. تزوجوا الودود الولود فإني مكاثر بكم الأمم أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. It should be done with the intention of that. So now when we have relations from the back into the wife's back private parts into her anus, then you are wasting your semen. That's one point. Also, medically, it's also wrong as well. Medically, doctors have mentioned that husbands who have relations like that, i.e. have relations in their wife's anus, then what happens is that over time, their dhakar, i.e. their male private parts, the husband's male private parts, it becomes bent. And it becomes bent, in other words, that they are then unable to have proper full intercourse with their wives from the front part. So because of these few reasons, it is best and advisable that and also looking at it from a Islamic point of view, that husbands should refrain from having anal sex with their wives. Totally haram, totally impermissible. I just mentioned one hadith, but there's so many hadiths where words such as faqad kafar has been used, i.e. they have become disbelievers. These kind of harsh and severe words have been used for those husbands who approach their wives from the back. So this is something which is unlawful. Unfortunately, the time we live in, when we see videos, unfortunately, and these kind of things, pornography materials and so on, that husbands, they have these kind of urges to fulfill their wife's desires in that particular way. But in reality, you're not actually fulfilling your wife's desires, because the anus area is not an area where the wife can derive any kind of pleasure or benefit. So you're not actually fulfilling desires. So because of these reasons, one should abstain from fulfilling desires in that particular area. Any questions about this particular topic, anal sex, before we move on to the next topic about oral sex? Any questions? You can use the messaging system on the right hand corner of the screen. As I already mentioned before, that if you have any other detailed questions or even like private questions, if that makes sense, then there's always the website. You could always email me a question there in private, and I'll able to answer it within the next week or so. Okay, a couple of questions some brothers are asking, or some brothers and sisters are asking. How about touching the area? Now, touching the area, you can touch that area, that's fine. But what you can't do is that you can't, say for example, insert your fingers into that area. Right, so you can't insert your fingers, or a husband can't insert his fingers into his wife's anus. That's going to be unlawful. It is also permissible actually for the husband, say for example, to rub his private parts around the area without inserting his private parts into the anus. So is that just to like rub his private parts around or in between the buttocks and so on, then that's allowed. But to actually insert his private parts into the anus area, then that is unlawful and that is haram. Another question here is that in anal sex only man is deriving pleasure, not the wife. You could say he's deriving pleasure in terms of ejaculation, but he's not actually getting the full pleasure, and the full pleasure is obviously through the front private parts. But yes, he is deriving pleasure in terms of obviously ejaculation. And then another person is asking about inserting the finger, that if a husband is allowed to insert his finger into the wife's anus. So as I mentioned, no, that's not allowed. But touching the area, then that is allowed, that is permissible. Okay, moving on to the next part, oral sex. Now, what is the rule with regards to oral sex? Now, first and foremost, I'll explain, and we got this in one of the messages one of the brothers sent, that these things about oral sex and so on, there was no such thing like that during the companions or the Sahaba's time. Yes, you never will find a text of the Prophet ﷺ or the Sahabas or the Tabi'in or Tabi' Tabi'in ever doing such a thing like that. So first and foremost, this particular practice was not prevalent during the Sahabas, the companions, the Tabi'in, the predecessors and their predecessor time. It basically is what we call a modern phenomena, because of the era or the time or the zamana we live in, that it's one of those modern things that this particular question has come about. And because it's one of those modern things, it's led to what we call differences of opinions. Some scholars say, well, it's allowed, some say it's not allowed, some say it's makruh, and so on. So the opinion which I'm going to give is basically my opinion from what I've studied, what I've understood from the research I have done on this particular topic. But as I've already mentioned, that because it's like it's one of those issues which weren't found in the blessed era, you will always come across ikhtilaf and differences of opinions. So there's no need for us to go into ikhtilaf and differences of opinions here. Okay, now if we have a look at the handout which is in front of us, it's explained there that if the oral sex includes the male private part being inserted into the wife's mouth to the extent that she swallows the filth, whether that filth is mani or whether it's pre-ejaculatory fluid, i.e. madhi, or the man takes the filth of the woman in his mouth. In other words, the man, say for example, is sucking his wife's private parts and he then swallows the filth, then that is not permissible and that is not allowed. In other words, that will be haram. So in other words, if a man's from his private parts semen is kind of dripping out, and in that particular state and hay'ah, the husband then inserts his private parts into the wife's private parts, then that would not be allowed, because it is natural, it is obvious that in that situation when the wife's mouth when the man's private parts is in the wife's mouth, she's going to be swallowing impurity and najas. And remember, mani and madhi, they both, according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, also Imam Malik rahimahullah as well, they are both impure and najas. And for the husband to suck and take the filth of his wife, and similarly for the wife to swallow the filth of the husband, then that is not allowed and that is not permissible at all. However, as I explained before as well, that if, say, for example, the wife's private part region is dry, or the husband's dhakar or male or his private part is also dry, and the, say for example, husband just kisses that area, or the wife kisses the male private parts area, so if it's just that, then that would be permissible, that would be mubah, although some scholars have considered to be disliked and makruh. So what I'm trying to say in a nutshell here, the rule about oral sex will be in a nutshell that if it entails the swallowing of the private parts, swallowing of the fluid of the private parts, then that would not be allowed. However, if it's a dry area and the husband was to just like, the wife was to like kiss that area, or the husband was to kiss the wife's private part area which is dry, then in that situation it will be considered to be okay and permissible, although best to, or rather preferable, that one kind of avoids it because of the differences of opinions. Now this then takes me on to the next point here. If you have a look at the handout there regarding using a dental dam, is that permissible or not? Let me just explain what is a dental dam, by the way. Dental dam is basically what you see the doctors or dentists wear when they're kind of operating on someone. It's like a mask, you could say, which covers the mouth, and then you have the edge of the mask going around the ears. Now I mentioned that obviously one of the reasons why, or the illah, or the cause for the impermissibility of oral sex is that because there is a danger of, you know, impurities of the wife going inside the man's mouth or vice versa. So that's why it has led to some people asking questions that, okay, if you're wearing a dental dam and then you kiss your wife's private parts when there's a lot of impurities and najis on that area, then that should be okay, because why should it be okay? Because no impurity is going into your mouth and vice versa. So that has led to a question that, is that permissible or not? So if you have a look at the handout in front of you, it explains that such a thing, or using a dental dam, would still, in my humble opinion, will still be impermissible to use. And based on what reason? Based on something what we call in Arabic as saddan lil zara'i or saddan lil bab. Like, what does saddan lil bab or saddan lil zara'i means? I'm sure with Cordoba Academy, I'm sure many of the brothers and sisters have done many principles or jurisprudence principles books or usul fiqh books, and one of the principles of fiqh is that there may be something which is permissible or mubah to do, but if that permissible thing may lead to something which is impermissible or repulsive, then that permissible thing will be considered to be impermissible. So what I mean by that is, okay, you're using a dental dam to suck, or to suck on your wife's private parts, but what could then happen is that husbands may think, oh, do you know what, these dental dams are just a waste of time, let me take it off and just use my tongue instead. So because something which is, say, mubah or permissible are using a dental dam, but because that may then lead to something repulsive, i.e. to mouth actions of the private parts and the sucking of the private parts and the taking of the impurity, so because of that reason it is best to avoid that. Okay, any questions from any brothers or sisters you would like to ask? Again, as I was explaining about the oral sex issue, that it's all based on different opinions. Some scholars may say it's okay, that's fine, that's according to their opinions. But if you're asking for my own personal opinion, then I'll say that it's best to avoid it, in particular and it'll be haram when obviously if there's impurity on. This sister is asking that would the same rule apply when the husband is wearing condom whilst oral sex? Yes, so the same rule will apply, that you've got a dental dam for husbands using it when they are say sucking their wife's private parts. So yeah, the example on the other hand will be the husband wearing condoms and then the wife, say for example, sucking that particular area. A sister is asked, or somebody's asking, is he allowed to insert fingers into the wife's private parts? I touched on this already actually. It's right at the beginning of the talk. I mentioned that husbands can insert their their private parts into can insert their fingers into the wife's private parts. So I mentioned that before as well. Okay, just very quickly, we don't have that much time left. Just very quickly, the next section and then the section about afterplay, inshallah, we'll look at it in next week's lesson. Now, the next section is regarding phone sex, and I think I touched on it before as well, that if by the phone sex, if it just includes or if it just entails a kind of erotic conversation between husband and wife, then that's fine, because she's a wife, and obviously if you want to have an erotic conversation, then don't have it with someone who's unlawful, have it with your own wife and your own spouse. So that is permissible. However, if the phone sex entails what we call the husband kind of masturbating, then that would not be permissible and that would not be allowed. What I mean by that is the husband and wife, they're having a phone sex, i.e. erotic conversation. Husband in one country, the wife is in another country, but what the husband is doing is that whilst on the phone, he's kind of fondling his own private parts, he's kind of masturbating and so on. So that would not be allowed. And the same also for the wife as well, that she may be in another country, but when she's talking to her husband in a passionate way, in an erotic way, then for the wife to kind of like fondle her own private parts, her breasts and her private parts, then that would be unlawful and that would be impermissible as well. So that in a nutshell is the ruling with regards to phone sex. What we'll do, inshallah, we'll leave it for this week. The next couple of sections we've got left about afterplay, wedding night, and some of the rules about abortion, contraceptions and so on, then inshallah we'll conclude it in the next week's lesson. And remember, next week's lesson is the final lesson of the 4-week course on intimacy of marriage. We've got a couple of minutes left. Again, any brothers or sisters, if you have any question they would like to ask, or if you want, you could always go onto the website on daruliftabirmingham.co.uk to ask questions. So any questions about today's topic or about what we have discussed over the past couple of lessons, the past couple of Sundays, any questions any brothers would like to ask, or sisters for that matter, the next a sister is asking that where can I get the handouts? I haven't received any. What you could do is that if you go onto the website daruliftabirmingham.co.uk, if you send me an email, then inshallah I'll email you the handout. As far as I know, the brothers who were in charge, I think Brother Azhar or from the Cordoba Academy, they should have given all the attendees handouts. Those of you who signed up for the course, they should have given you handouts, but I'm not sure why that is not the case. But what you could do is you could just send me an email on the Darul Ifta website, and I'll try to send you one as soon as possible. Okay, somebody's asking that. Yes, it's already on the Cordoba website, so you could also go onto there as well. A brother is asking that, what do you do if your partner is shy, doesn't like doing something what you desire? If she's shy, or if a wife is shy, say for example, then you should also respect her decision as well. The whole thing about marriage is that, it's all give and take, isn't it? So there may be something which you want to do, which is permissible, but your wife is a bit shy and she feels uncomfortable. So it's one of those things that you probably have to respect her decision, if that makes sense. You need to understand that, okay, Not everybody may be like you in terms of shahwa desires and certain ways you want to do things. So I think it's best that you understand her decision and respect that and not force the issue upon her. Inshallah, as I said before, that any questions any brothers ask, they could post the questions on the website. Allah gives the tawfiq to act once been said. Wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alameen.